welcome folks. Presuming everybody in here today knows what a cold chain is. If not, you're probably in the wrong room, but welcome. And just by a show of hands, can I know of folks who are implementing blockchain at the moment? Folks contemplating implementing a blockchain solution? Okay, a few, okay.
Can spell blockchain. Almost got a Bitcoin.
Yeah, we got the abbreviation, right? So,
yeah.
But Tim, if you want to talk a little bit about yourself.
I'm Tim. I'm from Cloudera. I do stuff. That's it. See me later. 1:35 in the big room, and 3 o'clock somewhere, talking about edge to AI, which blockchain is not part of the mainstream yet. But to me, that's part of this whole ecosystem where you have data, you want to put it somewhere, you get it out of somewhere. Maybe there's AI making those decisions. This one we're talking about, IoT data is getting put on the blockchain. Obviously, there's a lot of things in the Cloudera open source that make sense for that.
So I guess you folks probably getting a sense of how modest Tim is, but he's the man to go to if you have any questions on data in motion. And myself, I have had my company for about 20 years. Over the years, we have worked on web apps, big data apps, and IoT apps. And of late, the focus has been on blockchain solutions. So what is a cold chain? So if we were to dig a little bit into detail, there are things like food products, there are pharmaceutical products that we want to be maintained at or below a certain temperature. For an example is for example, vaccines. That if they go above a certain temperature, they are probably not as efficacious once the pharmacist or the physician will administer the vaccine to you. And the same with the food products. You know, there's propensity for the food products to spoil, things along those lines. And a cold chain is something of special interest, not just to us as consumers who consume food or pharmaceutical products, but also federal agencies like the FDA that want to make sure, for example, if we have a lot of flu vaccines, they come from Europe, you know, the UK, Germany. They want to make sure that all along the way, since the inception of manufacturing to the trucking company, to the distribution company, we have to make sure that there's provenance and the temperature of the vaccine in this particular case has been maintained in like the prescribed range. And at the moment, if you look at the current processes, it's a lot of handoffs in terms of, you know, emails going back and forth. And oftentimes it boils down to, you know, a trust. But you really, at the end of the day, you really don't know whether or not the particular vaccine has been maintained in a certain range. When the physician pulls it out of their refrigerator, you might feel that, yes, you know, it is been maintained at the prescribed temperature, but you never know what has transpired. So this particular slide, I just want you folks to think about, you know, there are many partners in like a cold chain ecosystem. Right from the manufacturer, you have the trucking company, you have the warehousing company. And oftentimes what happens is the regulatory body also gets involved, especially depending on, you know, the particular product that is being transported for the cold chain. And so this is just one story I have about plasma being sent from, there's a blood plasma being sent from the US to Japan. And oftentimes, you know, it goes by ship. But in this particular instance, they decided, you know, we wanted to get there faster. And they decided to use an aircraft for the transportation purposes. And one thing they did not realize that the cargo bay of the airplane is very cold. Besides, there are other factors in an airplane, for example, the gain in altitude, that again, impacts the quality of the plasma that was delivered. So when the plasma eventually landed up in Japan, all of it had to be discarded because it was not up to the standards. And this is just one example, but if you really go digging, you will find hundreds of examples like that, of things that were actually destroyed. How often do we not catch stuff and stuff that does not get destroyed? Again, that is debatable. So what I want to convey today at the end of the day is for you to walk away with a sense of why blockchain is really a big deal. And let's start delving into some of those things. So Frank Yanis, he was the director of IT at Walmart, and what they did was they decided to put all the leafy greens on a blockchain, the whole supply chain for leafy greens. So right from the farm all the way to the time we buy it at the supermarket, all the complete provenance is maintained on a blockchain. So what happens is, before the implementation of the blockchain, it used to take the FDA about 7 days to find out the source of a food contaminant in case of an adverse event. So what happened is, because it took 7 days, for instance, if there was E. coli poisoning or contamination with some lettuce, all the lettuce had to come off the market. And consequently, that is just a lot of losses right there in terms of everybody, all the lettuce coming off the market. Besides, the very fact that it takes 7 days implies that lives might be lost along the way. Now with the implementation of a blockchain, what used to take 7 days now takes them 2 seconds to find out the source of the contaminant. The source of the contaminant could have been at the farm, or it could have been a trucking company, a distribution company. So you can see, the tremendous amount of savings, not just in terms of lives from going from 7 days to 2 seconds, but also in terms of the sheer amount of material that does not have to be discarded just because we don't know whether that source or that lettuce, in this example, is good enough to be consumed. So since this experiment was very successful at Walmart, what Walmart said was, we want to mandate it. Everyone who supplies us leafy greens have to be on our blockchain network, and that mandate has to be met by the August of this year. So let's talk about why we went from 7 days to 2 seconds. What does the blockchain network actually do that lets us realize that kind of disruptive potential? So this is one particular use case that my company is working on for the aircraft industry. So what I have listed here is some of the broad players in the airplane ecosystem. And this is the current state of affairs. That each of these entities, for example, the FAA, the manufacturer, they persist data to their own databases. That is kind of shown by the little boxes on the bottom of the entities. And again, there is some communication between all those partners. And again, that can happen by way of emails, faxes, EDI, things along those lines. And then once we introduce the notion of a blockchain, what happens is, sorry about that, just flip back for a second.
This, unfortunately, is the speed of the blockchain. It's a little slower than you want because of constrained networks and the way the blockchain moves around. But if you visualize it, it doesn't look as bad.
Thanks for that, Tim.
Don't click it. Don't click it.
So now we introduce the notion of a blockchain. So what the blockchain does is, in addition to these ecosystem partners persisting to their own databases and using whatever communication methods they have amongst themselves, they also persist to the blockchain. So at a 50,000-foot view, you can think of a blockchain as like a database that is shared across all the ecosystem partners. And the blockchain network is responsible at the end of the day that the database looks the same to all the partners. So there is only one version of the truth. Is there any questions so far?
I think one thing that's important to mention here is the data is idempotent. It's not going to change.
Yeah, I'm coming to that.
That's important.
Okay. So again, this is just an illustrative example. So you can start conceiving of blockchain use cases. Once you understand that, you will see the cross applicability across many, many different domains. It's just like with the inception of a database, now we are using it for millions and millions of different use cases. Once you start understanding the rationale behind how the blockchain works, you will be able to start conceiving use cases. Anytime there is a touch point between two ecosystem partners, you can conceivably broach the question, is blockchain a good use case for interaction between us if trust is a factor? So again, pharma is something we're going to talk about today. And again, the food industry. Just to give you a sampling of all the different domains that are either already implementing blockchain or are contemplating using blockchain at the moment. So a couple of things I want to talk to you about in terms of blockchain that are very important high-level concept to kind of have with you, when you broach the question. So oftentimes, just because Bitcoin has made blockchain popular, Bitcoin and blockchain, they have become synonymous. But at the end of the day, the blockchain has nothing to do with any cryptocurrency. The blockchain is the underlying platform that runs that particular application of a cryptocurrency. And in the blockchain world, there are two important blockchain types. One is what we call a private blockchain, and the other is called a public. So Bitcoin is an example of a public blockchain where pretty much anybody can join the blockchain network and start transacting. And all the transactions are visible to all of the parties in the system. The blockchain, what happens in case of the Bitcoin is there is anonymity in terms of who is actually participating on the blockchain. But in terms of a private blockchain and the blockchain for business that we are talking about, is what happens is industry consortiums come together and say that, okay, we want to implement a blockchain solution. And the folks participating in the ecosystem, they are there by invite only. It's not like anybody can go in and say, okay, I want to just start participating. So in case of the Walmart example I gave you, Walmart said, okay, I want to invite all the farmers, all the trucking companies, and everybody else in the ecosystem to start participating. Just because, if you think of Bitcoin, I think one more thing that people don't realize is like Bitcoin, because it's public, and because there are a lot of concerns in terms of safety, it can only handle about 10 to 15 transactions a second worldwide. And that is just not good enough for business. But in case of private blockchains, since the parties that are transacting with each other, they know each other, what we can do is we can kind of lower the bar in terms of how much trust you have in your ecosystem partners. So when he talks about scaling the blockchain ecosystem, private blockchains, they scale to 2,000 to 3,000 transactions a second today. In terms of popularity, we have Hyperledger Fabric and R3 Corda. Those are the two major blockchain platforms in terms of private blockchains. R3 Corda is very big in finance. Hyperledger Fabric is excellent for a general purpose use case. So for example, for supply chain, Hyperledger Fabric is an excellent blockchain platform. And Hyperledger Fabric is part of the Linux consortium. So what happens is there is nobody who owns the software. It is all open source. And we have about 500 to 600 major corporate players in America that have become members of the Linux Foundation and the Hyperledger Foundation. And they are very actively contributing code to that Hyperledger platform. So what that means at the end of the day is every 2 or 3 months, we are coming up with newer and newer features that will help folks who are especially interested in blockchain for business applications. So supply chain being the use case. So what you are alluding to, how does the blockchain really work? So the first thing is append only. So what happens is when every time you write a transaction to a blockchain, those records, they are assembled in blocks. And those blocks are kind of appended to each other. So that's how the name blockchain came about. So, and the records are immutable. So once a block has been created, there is no way to go back and change that block. If suppose there was a mistake with the transaction, the only way to fix that transaction would be to create a reversing entry. And one more thing about the blockchain is, suppose there are 10 partners in an ecosystem. And if a partner wants to commit a record to the blockchain, that record will not be committed to the blockchain unless the other partners in the ecosystem agree that this is a valid transaction. And we allow it to be. So if I were to say, for instance, I want to transfer $1,000. If I don't have $1,000 in my system, as attested to by the other partners in the ecosystem, that particular transaction will not go in.
I like to frame this in, this is like Hadoop was 10 years ago, and see where it is now to see how valuable it is. Really, for me, some of this that's critical is this immutability. That's really critical that people can get together. It uses consensus algorithms, which anyone in the Hadoop ecosystem will know about. These are very important things for these transactions. It's a little less important when you do have that trust. But you have that trust, but there's still, this makes sure you don't have to worry about the trust as much because you have this immutability, so no one can say you didn't put that transaction value in there. And there's a lot of ways that this is going to be tied into the big data platforms, data in motion. It's just another way you're going to have your data and how you're going to connect between partners. So this is important technology. It might seem a little esoteric or a little different, but it's really, when it comes down to it, it's very similar to where we've been playing in.
Exactly. They call it a distributed ledger, but at the end of the day, it's a distributed database. And the software that sits on top of it to make sure that the ledgers of all the parties in the ecosystem, they're exactly in sync and they look identical. So one more way to phrase it is you can think about blockchain as a means to automate audits. Does that make sense? And secure. So what happens in terms of your private consortiums and private entities doing business with each other, oftentimes they do not want other partners in the ecosystem to be able to see the records that they are transferring. So for example, if there is a supplier of, let's say, lettuce, and that supplier supply to five purchasers, the supplier does not want the other parties in the ecosystem to be able to see what price they are giving, for instance. So what that means is, since this particular platform has been designed from the ground up to keeping the corporate America's requirements in mind, they have said that there is a notion of what we call private data. So you will be able to see the transaction on the blockchain if and only if you are authorized to see that particular transaction. Oftentimes you will hear about smart contract. So I'm not sure why they call it a smart contract. But at the end of the day, what a smart contract is nothing but just a piece of code that runs on the blockchain network. And that piece of code has all the logic in it that will determine who can commit what records and what are the rules of participating. So to give you an example, one of the use cases that my company is working on is for the aircraft industry. And what happens is what we want to provide is provenance for the maintenance history of parts on an aircraft. So for instance, if you think about an engine on an aircraft, they have lifespans of 40, 50 years. And along the way, it undergoes a lot of maintenance. Oftentimes it changes hands. And suppose somebody wants to, and there's an aftermarket for it as well. So suppose somebody wants to buy, let's say, an engine. They want full visibility into what has transpired with that particular part. Now what happens is, oftentimes that information is all buried in PDF documents, emails. If a company goes out of business, again, we lose that provenance and that history. So now we are committing every single maintenance operation on the aircraft parts of interest onto the blockchain. So where does a smart contract come in? So smart contract, so for instance, if a maintenance service provider might say, I have performed, let's say, this particular operation, I have done an oil change, or whatever the case might be. A smart contract will say, okay, now since you have done this, this is the workflow. So I want to transition from this step to that step. And it kind of automatically triggers some events. So you can think of a smart contract essentially as just code that is mutually agreed upon, that solidifies the understanding in terms of the governance of how records will make it on the blockchain and what happens to the record after it gets on the blockchain. Good. Questions? So now we come to the demo portion of our presentation. A lot of the folks already using Cloudera is probably very familiar with just about everything on this slide, except for what we have on the bottom left. And Tim, you want to talk about some of the?
Sure. So blockchain is its own data store. Now, we're not going to replace Hadoop with the blockchain. Blockchain is designed for a very important set of immutable data that you want to share with a private community. But when you get that data, you have to get the data into the blockchain in a reasonable fashion. So we have NiFi reading from trucks, reading the sensors. Through NiFi, we push it into the private blockchain so that it's immutable and it's in this shared thing and it'll follow those contracts. So it's nice, it's the data and the code are going together and it's shared between all these organizations who might be in different countries, different networks, whatever they have. This is one thing that they can agree on and sits outside of their infrastructure. But obviously, as someone who's participating in this, probably all those people want to take that data and put it in an analytical store because I still want to query on that data, and I'm not going to make queries every time to the blockchain. That's when there's something like, okay, I got to send a purchase order. It's kind of like what we do now with SAP. You do your online processing there. The data all comes into Hadoop for doing analytics and to share that so I can run machine learning. I combine that with other data. So we push data into the blockchain, and also at the same time, I dual ingest, put that into HBase for storage and for analytics. And then as the data is moving through the blockchain, other partners, I could pull that data from the blockchain when it gets updated. So I keep a record in my corporate data store so I could do analytics on it. Because you don't really want to query the blockchain unless there's a reason. And that reason's usually, okay, I'm adding a step, something happened, I want to see what happened to a part. So really, this is where your corporate users are going to query this. Blockchain, you want to keep that minimal transactions. It's just for the key applications. So to me, this is just another data-driven application that's interacting with your big data infrastructure. So as you can see, it's a pretty similar thing we do. Grab data, ingest it, push it to the blockchain. We do our own analytical processing on the data we store. And then at various points, we'll either ping into or have the blockchain send code out to us, and we'll store that. With NiFi, I can read it whether it's a REST API or I can make direct calls into the blockchain. And I've done this with Ethereum as well for public ones, because there's a lot of transactions. You might want to grab those too. So there's a lot of different private and public blockchains that might have a lot of data of interest to you. The public ones are a lot busier, but obviously might not be key to your critical business processes. So this is a pretty common architecture. And going forward with our new cloud version of this will be, you won't have to know all these boxes. It's going to be a button to ingest stuff and a button where you run your queries, and you don't care about all these 50 different things underneath there. But now this is what's under the covers when you're running your whole applications.
Thank you, Tim. So I'm just curious, is anybody here ingesting data using NiFi and NiFi at the moment? Okay, excellent. So you
I love
folks,
these people in the back there.
Yeah, me as well.
These are my new friends.
So you will be able to relate to some of the NiFi screens I'm going to show you just about in a second. And I can also show you, if you're interested, some of the architecture of Hyperledger, if there is enough interest. But if you can jump into the demo.
So on his laptop, he's got a live private blockchain.
Correct. So this is what a typical, for folks of you who understand Docker, you will be able to relate to this. So what we have here is we have what you see on the top, the dev, that is the actual Docker container that is running my smart contract. CLI is pretty much a command line interface to the complete blockchain network. And what I'm doing here is I'm mimicking a blockchain network of two organizations. So I'm calling it org1 and org2. So each of those organizations, they have their own peers. And their peers communicate amongst themselves, plus they also communicate with the peers across the other organizations. So if you see here, you say peer 0 org1, peer 0 org2. So these two orgs, so each of the organization 1 and organization 2, they are responsible for the management of their own blockchain infrastructure, and they are responsible for making sure that they expose the right ports and setting up the security and things along those lines.
So want to describe how they how they keep a local copy of the blockchain, or how they store it?
Okay, so you're talking about the database?
Yeah.
So at the end of the blockchain, we have the peers, they're communicating with each other, and also we have the database. So each of the peers will be tied to a particular database. So in case of Hyperledger Fabric, they're using CouchDB, and CouchDB has very, very rich query facilities. So not only can you persist data to it very fast, but you will also be able to do a lot of rich queries. So any questions on the Docker containers? Any of you architecturally inclined? Okay.
What tool are you using, like the GUI?
I'm sorry?
Like what tool are you using for the GUI?
Oh, this is,
Like that manages like Docker.
yeah, dock station.
Thank you.
Yeah, because that's a very nice Docker interface.
So what we have here is a simple NiFi data flow that we have set up. I have basically 3 processors. One is the generate temperature data. So that is essentially mimicking the data that would come from the sensors and report on the temperature.
Yeah, I mean, I have a device with temperature reading, but there's very little fluctuation in temperature in the room. So it's kind of boring to see the same temperature reading come through. Though I have done that in the past and realized that's not the best for a demo.
And so what happens, you have the blockchain network, and in front of that, we expose the blockchain using a REST server and the blockchain related APIs. So in this particular case, what we are having is NiFi is communicating with a REST server, which in turn is communicating with our blockchain network.
That's a pretty common way to get in there. There are native Java interfaces to all the blockchains. If we had higher performance requirements, we could do that, but usually with the speed of the blockchain, REST is fine.
And this is where you see the actual data that has been persisted to our blockchain network. So this particular angular screen is going and querying our CouchDB database and coming back with these results. What I'm showing, like, I have just put some arbitrary threshold. The numbers in green indicate that, you know, the temperature is within the desired range. If it goes out of range, you know, it's going to be colored in red. So, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, a common big data application would be, as that data is streaming in between the blockchain and your internal corporate network, when with NiFi, I'd be checking those against an approved range, or with using a machine learning algorithm. And when I get a violation, then that's going to be sent out as some kind of notification or alert to someone. And obviously, we're going to keep a storage of that anytime that it's gotten near or above a threshold. So a report can be made to say if it's something where it's not damaging the product, but it's just something that the consumer would want to know and say, okay, that's gone apart from the threshold too much outside of our operational range, which may be different for different use cases. Say like people use vegetables for human consumption, or it goes to animal feed. Mm-hmm. So there might be their range and say, okay, it can no longer be consumed at these stores. It's got to go over there, right. And those decisions can be made.
Absolutely. So this is just a toy example, but once you start looking at this, hopefully you can start thinking about, okay, it's probably a good idea to introduce the notion of humidity, for example. Or you might want to introduce the notion of, you know, GPS location. You know, I want the latitude, longitude. So again, hopefully this session has given you enough that you can start contemplating, you know, blockchain use case ideas within your own organization.
And it's not tied to one piece of data. You could put many data values.
You can pretty much. So you can think of it as long as you conceive of the blockchain as a distributed ledger that you share with partners. It can open up a whole world of possibilities in terms of what you can do with the blockchain. And working in tandem with the data in motion platform from Cloudera, you know, it's almost ludicrously easy, you know, to set up like a proof of concept within 3 or 4 days. It is not that difficult. The bigger problem oftentimes in the implementation of blockchain solutions in the enterprise space is the partners coming together and agreeing on the governance model. From a technology standpoint, it is not that complicated, but oftentimes partners talk about who is going to own the data on the blockchain. What if one of the parties decide to monetize some of the data on the blockchain? So those are some of the, I wouldn't say a stumbling block, but those are some of the factors that corporate folks think about, before they commit to coming together and implementing a blockchain solution.
What's cool about this, though, is we have a viewable, immutable set of data that all the people involved are sharing. It's not my company, what I decided to give to you in a view, and you don't know, is that what it really was, or is that just what you want to give me because I don't want to lose a contract or not going to lose money? Everyone has the same copy of the data, and you can't change it. So, I mean, that is something that, that's the trust part. So you know that was the copy of the data that went into the blockchain. It's the same copy I have. It's the same that everyone else on the blockchain has, unless there's some permissions thing like price, where there's some agreed value you're not seeing. But that temperature, everyone's seeing that. So I can't tell you, no, nothing happened. You have that copy. So you could do your own analytics on that to say you violated the terms of this, or that could be put into the smart contract to say as soon as you went above their range for more than 2 times, close it off or send it somewhere else. So that's critical.
So supply chain, of course, is a very big use case for blockchain implementations. If you folks are involved with pharma, again, clinical trials, you want a closed ecosystem, but at the end of the day, you still want, let's say, the regulatory body to be able to have complete insight into what is transpiring for that clinical trial. So again, that is one use case we are seeing a lot. And in terms of finance, there are very many applications because it has almost become like a no-brainer. So for finance, the banks, they interact with each other all the time. So they saw obvious value in alleviating some of the audit woes that happen at the end of the year in terms of how much transfers happen, things along those lines. So for them, it was very easy to form the consortium and say, okay, we want to establish our own private blockchain network.
And with this provenance we were talking about, it's in the blockchain, but with NiFi, I could push that into Atlas and Navigator, so you have a copy of that provenance within your own internal data stores, so you can run those analytics to see, where a particular shipment is in the real world, how it maps back. There's a lot of value you can get from this as part of your big data ecosystem.
Absolutely. So hopefully I've given you a flavor for what the blockchain is about and how it kind of sits well with some of the tools from Cloudera. So if you have any questions, happy to take them.
You may have answered this already, but in this example, has this been, are you taking this from an implementation that you've already done?
The aircraft one, yes.
Okay. It seems to me that, how did it fall out that who became the owner of the data? I mean, is it the part manufacturer, the warehouse? I mean, you're following it all through the chain. Everybody's got a dog in the fight.
Correct.
Everyone has that copy. Everyone has that data. It's the exact same copy. So it's a group ownership. That's what's unique with blockchain versus I have my own Hadoop instance and all my partners do too, and we send REST calls between each other and we make copies of the data. With the consensus algorithms, I have the exact copy. There's no, did my guy get the copy and your guy didn't? We all have that copy, so it's collective ownership. That's the hard part, right, to get people to agree on that.
So I believe there are 2 facets to it. One is from the audit perspective, all the partners in the ecosystem will have access to the data. But if somebody wants to monetize the data, then the party that created the data has ownership of the data. And they are not giving over the rights, to that particular piece of data.
So in this instance, what I hear you saying is the owner of the data, while everybody's got a copy, is the manufacturer of the initial part.
Transaction, correct.
Pushing it to the grocery industry, it would be maybe the vegetable grower. Because that head of lettuce is going to come off their farm, get cleaned, and I assume at So the generator of that data is the farm. It's going to be shake out to be their data. They create it.
as long as there's a handoff, but let us say that there's a handoff between the farmer and a trucking company, and the trucking company generates a piece of data that, I'm transporting it from warehouse A to warehouse B, then the transportation company would be the owner of that piece of data. So again, so the generator of the data will be the one who's actually owning the data.
So if it's in my truck and I had 12 sensors and I did those readings.
I'm sorry, sir, it's a question.
Yeah, so you've definitely inspired a lot of us to do proof of concepts, and I'm sure starting later this evening. So for are like Hyperledger Fabric or some of these other ones, do they provide the blockchain service where you just have to make API calls, like REST service calls, or do we have to come up with on a?
You have to spin up your own you have to spin up your own. You have to download it, and you have to spin up your own blockchain network. So this is the way we have seen it happen in practice, that, for example, AWS, IBM, Oracle, SAP, they all offer blockchain as a service, where you can go in and you can set up your smart contract and you can be up and running in relatively little time. The problem with that approach is it becomes very, very expensive for proof of concepts. So what we typically do is, since we know how to set up these networks, we create the smart contract on our own EC2 instances on AWS, for instance, or some compute instance on IBM. And we upload it, and once it is past the proof of concept stage and we are going into pilot or production where you need 24/7 support, then you can start using those services.
So by doing it yourself, if you've never seen it before, it's a little rough. I mean, there's a lot of different components. You're not sure which components to do. There's starter examples, but if you're serious that you might want to do it, it makes sense to find a partner to get you started, because it's kind of new. There's not a ton of tutorials out there.
So again, some of the technologies that go in Kubernetes, Docker, CouchDB, and then REST servers, API calls. So again, it depends on how much it runs the gamut in terms of what can and cannot be done in-house. There are tutorials for just about all these things, but it is not an easy proposition to come up to speed on really mastering blockchain.
Yeah, if you think big data is hard, I looked at that and go,
I'm sorry.
Mahul, can you help me? That's why he's here.
I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Yes, there are practical limitations to the length of a blockchain. So in that diagram up there, you had NiFi up there. There was a little thing that said event filtering. But you're sampling at some rate. You're writing at potentially a much different rate. How long can it make?
So that is a great question. That you don't want to bloat the blockchain. So in this particular use case that I've shown you, a better idea might be to average temperatures over the last 5 minutes, for instance. But conceptually, a blockchain will grow forever.
We had a transportation company who wanted to monitor shipment flow across the country.
Right.
It took 5 days. They were sampling at a sample rate of 1 second. By the time it got to the destination, the chain was so long.
Yeah. So obviously, you want to be cognizant of that, and you want to make informed decisions on how much to persist at what clip.
And how much you persist in Hadoop. I mean, that's the great thing with NiFi. NiFi can grab every rate. Again, we were talking about data ownership. If I'm the guy generating the data, I could put, numbers that make sense on the blockchain, whether it's an hourly summary or if there's an anomalous event. If something's at way above or is at an alert level, that's got to be on the blockchain. But the every second reading, let me keep that in Hadoop for doing analytics to see, run machine learning on and see if there's trends. But for...
Is there a good rule of thumb for those of us who go start our own little pilot here to, not do it every second, but what is a good practical length that I should be thinking about?
So again, I would throw the question back at you is how deep are your pockets, So in terms of
Small pockets.
well, in that case, we probably want a day.
1,000.
But
1,000 is your
yeah.
number. Keep
but
it under 1,000.
it's a very
values.
difficult question, and again, depending on the use case. So this is like a very simple use case that I illustrated, but in terms of, let's say you're monitoring a patient in the hospital, for instance, right? You probably want provenance for every single reading. So it really depends. I'm sorry, sir.
I was just wondering if you can add a new participant to an established blockchain.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You can not only can you add, but you can also drop. In terms, so the drop, what the drop implies, they will not be able to add more records to the blockchain. But the data that they have at their own premises, they will always have access to it.
Yeah, they'll still keep that copy of the data from that point.
And they're no longer part of the consensus.
Yeah,
Correct.
they're out of that. They can't participate anymore. They can't, if they use the blockchain locally, no one else is going to be working with it.
Yes, sir.
Considering a regular supply chain, but I understood that it is actually going to improve visibility and transparency a lot.
Exactly.
Let's say if we want to do a POC and we pitch the idea to management, they will ask what are the major sources of financial impact, like cost savings or something. So bringing in blockchain into the system, how is it going to make financial impact?
So again, you're looking to automate trust. So what kind of savings can I say when Walmart went from 7 days to 2 seconds? How you justify your particular use case is very difficult for me to kind of articulate. But anytime there is an interaction between partners, you want to conceive that can blockchain help in kind of alleviating or any kind of he said, she said kind of scenarios. It just depends on the use case, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's very specific. You're not going to put every piece of data or every interaction with a partner. I mean, some partner relationships are very straightforward and simple. That probably doesn't need a blockchain. But if it's a complex thing where money can be lost or there's a lot of things can go wrong and there's a lot of steps along the way and a lot of different players, like he was showing airline industry, car industry, where you have 6, 7 different sets of companies and maybe there are multiple partners at each level. It can be really hard to know, like you had the lettuce, this lettuce made people sick. How do I know without that blockchain, all those steps? You maybe kept good records, but you don't know the records that your partner right before you did or the truck company before them. That's where it starts getting to be valuable.
Our discussions, there are 2 points that we came up with. And the first one is complexity or problematic relationships. Like you said, if it's a simple relationship where we buy this product, you drive it over and we sell it,
It's easy.
provenance is easy. But the other one that everyone is on is legal exposure.
Also, just to get back to you, my last point I would like to make is the blockchain, as a concept is a little hard to kind of articulate from the offset. So you probably want to think about just doing a small POC and having the team members and executive folks, getting their hands dirty and looking at it in action as opposed to, conceptually just drawing a diagram would be my suggestion.
And it's got to be something where there's potential lawsuits or other legal issues, or like they were saying for Walmart, you're talking about E. coli, you're saving lives. If it's something that critical and you don't really have a good way to get that data between partners, that's when to start thinking about that.
So I'll leave you with one thought that Frank Yen is the guy from Walmart. He has now joined the FDA. And now he's saying, we had such good experiences that I want every single department in the FDA to start contemplating blockchain. And the education process is underway. I'm talking to some folks over there about doing some POCs.
So you might not have a choice for some things. They might just come with a blockchain.
Some folks like Walmart, they can just twist your arms, or the FDA for that matter. But yeah, thank you so much, folks.